Fighting Blindness Canada's Viewpoint is a virtual education series that brings you the latest in vision research presented by health experts from across Canada. The webinar you're about to watch is a recording. To learn more about the research we fund and upcoming webinars and events, please visit our website at fightingblindness.ca. This Viewpoint webinar is proudly presented by Bayer and supported by Allergan, Biogen, Janssen, and Novartis. We'd also like to thank Accessible Media Inc., our national accessibility partner. Everyone here should download the AMI app, which is a fabulous resource. And you can watch excellent programming, including previous Fighting Blindness Canada events. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy this webinar and share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you today to our guest speaker. Dr. Jacob Rouleau is a clinician scientist and associate professor in the Ophthalmology and Biomedical and Molecular Sciences Department at Queen's University. That is a mouthful. His research interests include understanding how the immune system interacts in the eye, and he is recipient of the Fighting Blindness Canada's Clinician Scientist Emerging Leader Award. So today, Dr. Rouleau will be joined by our Director of Research and Mission Programs, Dr. Larissa Moniz, to have a conversation about his research. And once they're done, we'll open the floor to your questions. So do remember that anytime you can type them in at that Q&A button at the bottom or email me at education@fightingblindness.ca. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Larissa and Dr. Rouleau.
Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. And thank you, Jacob, for Dr. Rouleau for joining us. And thank you, Steve, for such a great presentation. I learned a lot. It was a bit of a whirlwind, but I'm looking forward to going through those slides again afterwards. So as Morgan mentioned, we'll do about a half an hour conversation with Dr. Rouleau here, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Morgan gave a really brief introduction to who you are and what you do, Dr. Rouleau. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself and what your background in vision research is to start out with.
Sure. So I'll begin by saying I kind of got into ophthalmology quite accidentally. It was I was probably gearing up to do liver or heart research and clinical medicine, and it wasn't until an accidental rotation kind of got me involved in the eye, and I really enjoyed looking at things in real time, and I felt that it was a very nice system that probably I could make a big difference in, given that you're looking at things and have access to samples and things of this nature that allow us to probably ask really important questions. And so my research has always kind of been in the areas of inflammation, and it wasn't until likely when I got into my residency, I started dabbling a little bit into different molecules that may be accumulating in the eye. And that's how the whole vitamin D project came about. With respect to being a clinician scientist, this is something I embarked on. I guess I started back in 2002 in my undergrad when I first started doing undergraduate research. And at that time in Canada, there were only a few programs that would offer dual training as a physician and a scientist. And I went to Toronto for 9 years, and that's how the process began. And subsequently I went to Queen's to do my residency training and additional research in the area of the eye. Clinician scientists typically in the area of basic science research will spend upwards of 70 to 75% of their time in the lab, where they're doing experiments and writing grants, writing papers, and then 25 to 30% of the time will be in a clinic setting where you're seeing patients. And that's somewhat what I'm doing basically here at Queen's currently. I'll spend about 4 days a week in the lab and 1.5 days in the clinic.
Oh, that's great. So can you maybe explain a little bit about why you're sort of making the effort to both maintain your research career as well as your clinical practice?
It's a good question. I think that's something we've been asked throughout our careers, especially in interviews. And why do this? Why spend the time doing the research? You can make an argument that just as much time should be spent in a research setting as it is in a clinical setting, because both would demand a high amount of energy and time. Someone like me, I've always been a curious person. I like asking questions, and that's kind of always fueled my drive to always want to try to figure out the answer. And for me, when I got into ophthalmology, I realized quite quickly there are a number of diseases that present, and essentially there's not really much that we can do. And, you know, compared to a lot of the other diseases that we see in medicine, in ophthalmology, there's only a few things that we offer. Drops to lower pressure, and now injections have really taken over for people with various types of wet or neovascular diseases of the eye. And so to me, this was something that's probably needs a lot more energy and time to find different ways that we can prevent these diseases from ever getting to that point. And so I saw this as an opportunity to kind of lend my area of expertise, which is not necessarily in the eye where I started out with, but to kind of approach things from a different angle.
That's really interesting idea that there haven't been a lot of treatments till now. Do you think now with the increase in treatments coming out that will maybe inspire more scientists and more clinicians to get into ophthalmology as we're seeing sort of these really innovative treatments entering the market?
Right. And I would say in Canada, the clinician scientist or clinician scientist ophthalmologist is not very common. For those that are listening that have entered ophthalmology clinics, there are always long waits and large numbers of people that are always waiting. And so the demand on the doctor to actually see these patients is quite high. So it doesn't leave much room for people like myself to go in and spend time in the research setting, because you're just being pulled in too many directions. So my hope is that people like myself and others that are pursuing this path can start to show young trainees, this is an opportunity. We push our departments to support people like ourselves, and that's going to kind of be the setting for it. The model of a scientist and clinician comes down to funding, and funding in Canada for these sorts of positions is not the greatest. So the hope is that we'll start to see alternative models be introduced in Canada that will allow for this sort of enterprise to be more successful.
Yeah, actually, by everything you're saying, that's actually part of the reason we started the Clinician Scientist Emerging Leader Board. Of course, we're one of the recipients, is really trying to support this next generation of scientists. And we have a new one this year. So just a little plug, if anybody is watching and is a young clinician scientist and wants to apply. So I'm just going to switch tack a tiny bit. We're going to talk more about your research. But before we do that, I was wondering if you could just set the stage a bit and give a brief overview of what age-related macular degeneration is and how it affects the eye for anybody listening who maybe isn't as familiar.
Okay, sure. So macular degeneration, or age-related macular degeneration, as the name has suggested, is an aging disease, and essentially something that we see towards the last third of people's lives. And it's something that is a mixed bag, and it's not a quick one gene, one disease sort of situation. It's actually an accumulation of various factors that lead to a slow deposit of material at the back of our eye where our central vision is formed. And essentially those deposits, which they are known as drusen, accumulate and coalesce and start to affect the transmission of light over time. And your body eventually starts to respond to these drusen or these plaques and starts to say, well, we can't get what we need to actually maintain the vision that is being put onto the system. So the eye responds by forming these abnormal blood vessels in a small percentage of people, which it thinks is doing a good thing, but in fact just can make the visual situation for the patient far worse. So that's what people know as the wet age-related macular degeneration. The good news is that that's a very small minority of patients with AMD. The majority of people have the dry variant, which is the deposits that happen. The issue with AMD is we have something to treat the wet AMD phenotype now with these injections, and they're very effective. But the dry, currently we don't have much that actually prevents those deposits from forming. And I suspect that's likely because it's an accumulation of material over time, almost akin to how plaques develop in heart disease. It's not a, you wake up one morning and you get a plaque. It's the slow accumulation as a result of a variety of things, from exercise, diet, things that predispose your body to injury like smoking. AMD has a very similar profile of things that can cause these, but as well, there's a huge component related to gender and age and things and genetics that we actually can't control. So,
can you speak a little bit more about some of those risk factors actually? So you mentioned gender, you mentioned race. So which ones would put you more at risk for AMD?
So,
and is it wet AMD or dry AMD or both?
Well, typically the risk profile that people would say is people that are older, people that are female, lack of exercise, smoking, and then there are the less definitive but would make sense from a scientific point of view, things like excessive amounts of UV light. As you can imagine, UV light, similar to what a magnifying glass does with light, it can actually cause injury. That's a topic for a whole nother conversation. But then there's things that people found relationships with the color of our eyes. The lighter the eye, potentially the more likely you could get more injury happening at the back. I think I mentioned most of them. The genetic profile is the genes that people have found that can put you at risk. And this has to do with how much inflammation your body is predisposed to.
That's actually a perfect segue, because I think it'd be great to talk a little bit more about your research. So you said you're really interested in inflammation, and it sounds like you've been interested in inflammation even before you got involved in ophthalmology.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about what the large research questions you're trying to answer are. So as you're starting your research career, like what role do you see inflammation playing in health and eye disease?
So I'll take a step back and say that the one thing in ophthalmology that's very unique than a lot of other areas in medicine is the eye is basically is made up of two compartments where fluid essentially is circulating within the eye, similar to blood, but not really. And that fluid actually can provide a lot of the nutrients and nutrition to areas of the eye, in addition to the blood that's coming in from the heart. Those two compartments, we actually are in a fair amount of the time in surgery. And so I got very interested in these compartments. They're called the aqueous and vitreous humor. And I wondered, could we be looking at these two areas in people with various diseases and ask questions about what is in here that's different than people without? And so that's the kind of global idea, which is looking at the ocular microenvironment and how it's different than the body, kind of saying, we can't look at the blood when we're going to, the lab through our arm and ask questions about the eye. It's probably that there's very small concentrations of things that we can actually see only if we were to sample directly in the eye. So that's the approach I've been taking and asking about various different molecules, vitamin D being one of them, that could be in the eye, and what's it doing there, and how does it affect normal inflammatory pathways and the development of, they say, oxidative stress or injury from too much pro-inflammatory pathways being activated. So this is the area that I've been trying to dabble in.
Yeah, so your clinician scientist emerging leader award is really looking very specifically at the role of vitamin D
Correct.
In AMD, right? So
correct.
Can you just maybe describe this research a little bit? So what prompted you to start this study,
Right.
but also what have you found in the past couple of years?
So the big thing that we were wondering this was probably back in 2015, 2016, was if you think about how vitamin D is made in the body, it starts off, there's diet, but there's the big aspect of vitamin D is how light hits your skin when you go outside. And there's a big pathway that you need to be sitting in the sun for the skin to convert cholesterols into these precursors of vitamin D, which then go to the kidney and the liver to become active vitamin D. So I thought about this, well, wait a minute, the eye is essentially staring at light all day. Would it not make sense that the eye could do the same thing? It would be a site for active vitamin D production. And sure enough, nobody was actually looking at vitamin D in the eye and the signaling pathways in the eye at the time. There was a lot of studies looking at, well, what happens in the blood of people? Are they vitamin D deficient? You always hear these, am I vitamin D deficient? And we're looking at what's happening in people's blood. But I said, fair, but what is actually happening in the eye? So we took a step back, and I worked with an investigator at Queen's, where we basically tried to figure out the pathway that exists in the eye. And sure enough, our preliminary work, which we published at the beginning of last year, showed that there is the vitamin D precursor. It's called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. This is the commonly measured vitamin D precursor in the blood. And the reason that they measure this has to do with how stable it is. And it's a very good marker for active vitamin D, or 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. It can get quite confusing because you just hear vitamin D and it encompasses all things, but it's actually quite different. What was interesting was not the fact that we were finding it in the floating humors of the eye, which was unique on its own, but that the actual retina, or the makeup of what processes vision, had very unique distributions of the enzymes that regulate how much vitamin D is active and how much vitamin D is degraded. And they weren't always expressed at the same areas. They had different areas of where they were expressed, suggesting that perhaps the retina processes vitamin D different in the eye. Of course, it's a very small compartment and it makes it very difficult to study, but this set the stage for, okay, now what do? We need to try to figure out different animal models. Is there things that we can do to test whether giving vitamin D is good, whether giving vitamin D is bad? As I mentioned, don't forget, UV light, too much of it can actually be bad. So is there something with vitamin D and UV in the eye that needs to be handled differently than the skin? So these are sorts of the questions that we're getting involved in. If I take you back to what we were looking at, we essentially were studying, in particular, patients with neovascular disease, which was patients with age-related macular degeneration, diabetes, and a number of other conditions where too much blood vessel formation is happening, affecting vision. And these are people that were getting injections. So as a result of them getting an injection, we had an opportunity to take a sample of fluid from the eye and therefore ask what is inside that fluid. And sure enough, what we were seeing is that vitamin D was inside the eye, but we found higher amounts of the precursor vitamin D in people with neovascular disease, mostly in diabetics, but also in people with age-related macular degeneration. And so it was actually counterintuitive. We would have expected that the healthier eye would have the most, and then the more neovascular disease would have the least, but it was actually quite the opposite. So this has now started a number of questions, which is it because there's new blood vessels forming and we're seeing the leakage of this precursor inside the eye? So maybe it shouldn't be in the eye to begin with, and now it's entering the eye. Is it that the precursor is there because we can't convert into the active molecule vitamin D, and that speaks to the enzymes that we were finding inside the eye? So a lot of these questions are now kind of at the forefront of what we're trying to do and trying to understand what's happening. If you look at studies at least 10 years ago where they gave active vitamin D to animal models of neovascular disease, it actually shuts down the neovascular disease. So it would suggest that whatever's happening from what we're seeing, there is something that's floating around inside the eyes, but that may not necessarily be a good thing, and we need to kind of interrogate a little bit further. Sorry, a mouthful.
No, it's really interesting, but you're right. It's quite complex thinking about the precursor as well as then the active form. So I guess a couple of follow-up questions. In a broad sense, do you have an idea of what vitamin D is doing in the eye, and the idea that people who have neovascular disease have higher levels of vitamin D? Am I correct in that?
In the fluid, yes, but not actually in the tissue. We haven't been, so where macular degeneration is actually affecting, we don't know in the tissue what is happening. So what's happening out in the space could be very different than what's happening at the actual site. So that's what, and that we can't do human studies on. That's going to require more lab-based approaches. And that's what we're doing currently, is trying to get at this site, what's happening right here versus what's happening there. And what is vitamin D doing? That is an excellent question. So you can look at it as the typical role of vitamin D and then non-typical roles. The typical role of vitamin D, you would think of calcium as a huge calcium regulator. Everyone that knows about going to the doctors and they have low vitamin D levels, or they can be en route to becoming getting osteoporosis, they get vitamin D supplementation. So is there a calcium role in the eye that we haven't quite figured out that might be involved with vitamin D? That's the one question. But likely we're probably thinking this has to do with inflammation, shutting down inflammation, and the growth of abnormal blood vessels. We have some really interesting data, which I can't really talk about because we're not quite sure exactly, but there is evidence to suggest that there is a very strong relationship between the enzymes that convert vitamin D and abnormal blood vessel formation in the eye. So now we need to get into the testing. If we administer different compounds that promote or block these pathways, what happens to blood vessel formation?
So I guess, yeah, one of the questions is higher levels of vitamin D causing the blood vessel growth, or is it the blood vessel growth increasing the amount of vitamin D? Do you know, or do you have a hypothesis of which way that goes?
Right. So if you think about, so I'll take a step back. A lot of people with vascular disease, all comers, people, heart, blood vessels in the legs, elsewhere in the kidneys, will be relatively vitamin D deficient in the blood. So is it possible that the deficiency in vitamin D could be driving abnormal blood vessel formation, or in fact promoting this to happen at an accelerated level? Yes. Do I think high levels of vitamin D? No. There's never been any data to suggest that people with AMD or neovascular disease of the eye are rich in vitamin D. But there is definitely a question about what happens when the eye starts to have disease. Do these pathways then shift into becoming abnormally active? And maybe that's why we're seeing certain things. But I don't think this has anything to do with supplementing too much vitamin D. That is not the situation, no.
Okay, so sort of looking maybe at the whole body like you're talking about, you might have actually mentioned this, but just to clarify, so have you looked at, say, blood from the patient as well as the ocular fluid, and is there a correlation? So are people who have higher levels in the eye, do they also have higher levels in the body, or you can't see that?
Right. So what we found when this first study that we looked at, that there was no relationship between so yes, we did look at the blood and the eye at the same time, and there was no relationship between what we were measuring in the eye and what we were finding inside the blood. So that was one. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that if we supplement people, we can't get more into the eye. There are animal studies back in the early 2000s that showed if you were to feed rabbits lots of vitamin D, you could actually get more inside the eye. That's not necessarily a human, so we can't necessarily extrapolate that. But that is definitely the question of, can we get it to the site? And then the question is, if it's a damaged eye, will it still take up the right amount of vitamin D? So that's a whole nother question. So it's interesting. The more I think about it, the more I think this is going to be a very long process to get to the answer, but it definitely warrants additional investigation. And we're writing a number of grants right now to get funding to help support these sorts of questions. As you can imagine, there's lots of ways that this can go from here. So
I know people are always so interested in the idea of what supplementation or diet, how that can impact health, because it's one of those few things that we can actually control. So based on either your research or other research out there, is there anything you can say about either vitamin supplementation or diet or other vitamins that might be useful for improving eye health, maybe specifically AMD, but any eye disease?
I'm sure most of the people with AMD are familiar with what's known as the AREDS formulation, or compositions that have been made by pharmaceutical companies, Vitalux, or there's another one. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the vitamin. Essentially, it's a combination of vitamin C, vitamin E, calcium, copper, zinc, and a number of types of other components, lutein, zeaxanthin. So this formulation, which is commonly been studied, and now I forget how long it's been, it's got to be over 15 years, where they've actually shown that even over the long period of time, people that take these supplements in particular have a 25 to 26% reduced risk of forming advanced age-related macular degeneration. That is the only thing it has shown to date. It has not shown people without AMD do not get AMD if they take the vitamins, and it doesn't show people with very early AMD. It has to do with that very focused group of people with a more intermediate, or it looks like it's growing AMD, and if those people take the supplements, that's what prevents the advanced or the sometimes the wet form of AMD. So that's where vitamins have been implicated. In terms of other vitamins, looking at things like vitamin, I think A, and then of course D, that's far more controversial. Vitamin A, especially when you talk about degenerative diseases of the eye, it's quite a hot topic because it can make things better, or at least maybe less progressive in some situations. That's something that we see in patients with retinitis pigmentosa. But then if you have the flip side of that, someone with a genetic condition such as Stargardt's disease, they don't recommend any vitamin A because of the fact it can make Stargardt's worse. And this has to do with the way that light is processed and how vitamin A is really critical for how we see in day and at night. It's quite a complex pathway, but essentially people with Stargardt's disease have a unique mutation that prevents them from actually processing the vitamin A, and you can actually lead to more toxic accumulation. So therefore they always recommend you don't take extra supplements. But that being said, you still need vitamin A for normal processing. So it creates this very difficult balancing act for certain conditions and not for others. So, but there are, sorry, just to be, there is a drug, which is a vitamin A derivative that's currently in clinical trials. I believe it's a phase 2, where they're looking at patients with geographic atrophy, and the use of this drug orally, Fanretina. I don't want to be misquoted. I believe it's, I was just reading about it. Anyways, this has been shown to actually maybe slow the progression of the end stage AMD to becoming even more advanced. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of information on vitamins. The problem when you say vitamins is that you think, oh, well, you just take, it's not just the vitamin itself, it's what happens to that vitamin as it's being degraded. And then there's these smaller molecules that actually may be the thing we need to actually be focusing on.
I think from your description, it's clear how specific the role of some of these vitamins are. So you can't just take a multivitamin like you're saying, and depending on your eye condition, it's really about making sure it's the right one for you and talking to your eye doctor before you start taking anything. I'll ask one more question before I turn it back to Morgan. I'm just sort of getting back to the beginning when you were talking about inflammation. So you can choose which question to answer. So either do you know what the role is between, say, vitamin D and inflammation in the eye specifically, or on a broader topic, what role does inflammation play in both a dry and wet AMD?
So the latter portion of that question, which is what is inflammation doing? And so AMD initially wasn't thought to be so inflammatory, but now they're showing that it's actually, there's a huge inflammation component. And that has to do with a lot of the genetic predispositions that promote certain molecules to accumulate in this area of the eye that cause macular degeneration. So yes, it is definitely an inflammatory disease, and it plays a role in the initiation and in the progression. But the problem is that there's no simple one-stop inflammatory shutdown that you could use in the eye to date. They've tried a number of very specific molecules so far, and the clinical trials haven't come out as being very successful, but there's lots in the mix that people are testing. So I think the story is going to be growing, and we'll probably hear a lot more about that. And then for vitamin D, vitamin D was initially described as something that regulated the way white blood cells talk to one another. So it will be very interesting to create situations in a lab where we see all this inflammation happening at the back of the eye and giving various compounds of vitamin D to block that. What's attractive for using vitamin D molecules is that they're relatively safe and they are routinely used for supplementation. So if we can figure out which right part of the pathway to, I don't, hijack is a bad word, but to kind of enhance or complement, that would be something that would be very attractive. And that's kind of what we're moving into. So
yeah, no, sort of like linking it all back together.
Right.
Just in terms of the inflammation piece, so
Mhm.
when you say that AMD is inflammatory disease, would somebody who has AMD, would they potentially have markers of inflammation in other parts of their body or other things like that, or is it very
Right.
sort of focused in the eye?
That's a little bit more controversial, but there are studies. So if you look back in the cardiovascular literature back in the early 2000s, there was a molecule called C-reactive protein, which was being hailed as the new inflammatory marker that predicts whether someone's going to have a cardiovascular event, so therefore a heart attack. And actually, there are still centers that will use certain levels of the C-reactive protein as a marker for whether you will get a heart attack and what is your risk profile to getting a heart attack in 2, 5, 10 years. There has been a group that has done this for the eye, and they have shown that the C-reactive protein is also linked to people with various forms of the advancing macular degeneration. The question is it specific to AMD? I don't think so. I think what happens is we're seeing a very unique profile between people with AMD and people with vascular disease in the heart, and the two are risk factors for one another. Therefore, if you're getting heart disease, you're likely going to see macular degeneration in certain patients that have those other risk factors. So if you were to take blood and say, oh, look, my C-reactive protein is a little bit high, does that mean you're going to find AMD? No. But if we look at people with developing AMD and heart disease, you probably will find elevated CRP in the blood. But the CRP is produced in the liver, so it's not a thing you can block. It's just an indicator that it's happening.
It's just sort of like a warning signal out there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You need to look out for something.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for telling us so much about your research. I know we definitely have questions from the audience as well. Sure. So Morgan, why don't I throw it back to you and you can take over.
All right, we have lots of questions coming in, which is great. So again, just a quick reminder, you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, send me an email, education@fightingblindness.ca. You can also, if you would like to do it over audio, you can raise your hand and then I will call on you as well. So let's get right into it here. We have a question in the chat from Geetha. And Geetha says, how do we block UV light if we constantly have to work in front of a computer screen? Are there specific glasses like blue light blocking glasses available in the market?
So that's a good question. This research had come out back during the early days of cataract surgery, where they were saying, well, look, the cataract is filtering out all the bad light that needs to get to the back of the eye. And the worse your cataract gets, the worse your vision gets. But of course, that means that not as much that UV is getting into the back of the eye. There was concerns that if we removed that cataract and put a intraocular lens or that implant to help people see again, now are we allowing all that bad UV to get to the back of the eye? And there was concerns about this, and it promoted a whole concept of UV light blocking lenses. And to my knowledge, a lot of this is still being used and it hasn't shown to be harmful. Well, there is the link that too much UV light will be bad, and therefore if we're allowing more to get in, for sure we should see the damage. But again, UV light over a few years, you're probably never going to see the issue. Again, this is something that's a lifelong event that's happened over years of us, staring and working in the environment. The issue with computers and filters, I don't know where I stand on that yet, because there are some wavelengths of the UV light that are actually beneficial. So you do need some of those to be getting into the eye. But of course, with the good comes the bad. So do I think if you're on a computer using a UV light filtering glasses would be harmful? No. Would it have probably some benefit? Yes. But to be blocking everything out, I think would be unnecessary. I think it has to do with how many hours you're on the computer, similar to working outside.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have another question here from Keith. So Keith is asking, is there a connection between cholesterol levels in the eye or blood and vitamin D levels in the eye?
So that's an excellent question, Keith. And there have been some studies that show that cholesterol conversion inside the eye is probably what might be leading to the formation of drusen, and hence why we see people with cardiovascular disease and AMD kind of being part of the same group. There have been some early trials that looked at the use of statins, which are a very useful drug in people with early cardiovascular disease and people who've had myocardial or heart attacks. And they used doses of the statins to show that potentially drusen could be reduced. And I remember going to a presentation 5 years ago where someone was showing me that data, and it actually looked very exciting that the use of statins could be reducing drusen. But I haven't seen the subsequent larger trials take place. And the issue might be that statins at higher doses can actually have a number of side effects. And so is it a balancing act between how much reduction in cholesterol versus the side effect profile that is going to be the issue? But definitely, I agree that there is a relationship between cholesterol and AMD. The question between vitamin D and cholesterol is one we're trying to get into, because the way that you get to vitamin D is through a cholesterol synthesis and degradation pathway. So is it possible that with injury, there's an accumulation of cholesterol byproducts that might be causing more damage? So that is why we were wondering about certain things that we're seeing measuring inside those fluid compartments of the eye. So the short answer is no, I don't have evidence that vitamin D and cholesterol in the eye are linked, but something that we're definitely going to be looking at.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's try to take one over audio. So I've got Jerry Waldner. So Jerry, you should be able to unmute and ask your question. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Jerry. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm wondering, does LED lighting create UV?
Did you say LED lighting?
Yes, correct. And will that affect RP? I know it's different than what you're talking about.
Explain. Can you explain to me a little bit about LED lighting? Are we talking about the way that the light is generated?
No, just LED lighting in general. Do LED lights create
more
yes,
UV? Okay, right. That's actually a very good question. It is, so not all light is created equal, and it all depends on how much of, they say, that blue or the ultraviolet spectrum of light is being produced from it. So not all LED lights have the same spectrum of light. They may be pushed more towards the blue side of the light spectrum, and that's where people get concerned, is that causing too much of this UVA and UVB to getting into the eye. But but I'm not exactly sure if which LED light might actually be responsible for that.
Yeah,
and even in that case, we still don't know for sure if it's causing an effect. We know from some research they call them cell culture assays, that certain forms of light can cause injury, but when that's a cell in a dish. When you're talking about a whole human, that's very different.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Good question. So let's see. So I have another question here from Katie. So Katie says the ARID study was also conducted on those who are 65 years or older. As a younger person with macular degeneration, she says she's under 40. She'd like to know if there are studies being conducted that incorporate younger people.
That's a very good question. So I guess the main question would be, if at 40 years of age, would yours be the aging variant, or would there be something more of a genetic predisposition aspect that might be involved? And then I still think that despite there being the studies looking at 65 and older, given how safe the supplement formulation has been, in order to prevent that particular form from progressing, taking those supplements would work. These studies were done out of the National Eye Institute in Baltimore, I believe, and essentially they would be the ones that would probably be running the studies. But I would think that given the small minority of people with macular degeneration at a younger age, it would be very difficult to run that wide scale type study, because this is, as we've discussed, this is something of people, older than 65. So if you're asking whether taking the supplements would be beneficial even at the age of 40, my answer to that would be, if you have an advancing form and you want to prevent that from progressing, yes, the supplementations would be effective. But don't forget, there's a number of other things that can be equally beneficial, such as exercise. If you smoke, quitting smoking, wearing sunglasses if you're spending prolonged periods of time in the sun, eating what they say, that Mediterranean diet has been very beneficial. So the dark leafy greens, lots of color in your vegetables, these things can be equally beneficial.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but Fran asked, maybe you could just clarify. So Fran said, is there any evidence of effect on vitamin D on genetic cone dystrophies such as Stargardt disease? So I think you mentioned this earlier, but she's read that vitamin A could have a negative effect if you have a particular gene.
So vitamin A is the main, the way that vitamin A is broken down at the back of the eye is what can lead to the accumulation of these byproducts that can lead to damage, both what we see in macular degeneration, but more so in people that have these mutations in this gene called ABCA4. So that's the vitamin A story. I don't think vitamin D accumulation or byproduct accumulation is very similar to vitamin A, because that has to do with how vitamin A is involved in what's known as the visual cycle of processing light. But no one's looked. So the question is going to be, what happens at the photoreceptor that's actually processing this information, vitamin D, and those studies are in their infancy. So it's just too early to tell.
Sure. So we have a lot of questions here about vitamins, right? Which is always what comes up when we talk about AMD.
Oh yeah, it's very controversial, vitamins, right?
For sure. So, so a couple questions. Tibor says, in Vitalux, there's no vitamin D, but do you recommend taking Vitalux in help slowing AMD?
That's an excellent question, and I hope to have that answer for you. But I would be speculating right now before I would know the answer to that. We're still not sure what it's doing inside the eye. In fact, if you ask a lot of the vitamin D people, the gurus in the field that have been looking at vitamin D in bones and kidneys, if you said, what about the eye? They'd say, well, no, doesn't exist. It's not, there is no known role. So we're kind of entering unpatrolled waters. We don't know what to expect, and we don't know which way it's going to go. It makes sense that there should be a role given the setup of the eye and how the eye works from a science point of view. And our early research would suggest that, yes, there is definitely a role. The question is going to be when, how, and if, right? So that's what we're hoping to get to.
So currently you're not.
I'm sorry, actually, let me take a step back. They have looked at vitamin D in the blood in patients in large scale studies and showed there was no difference in people. There was no difference in the levels of vitamin D in people with macular degeneration. That was by the same large study group that came up with the AREDS formulation. So that suggested that they weren't going to add vitamin D. But I actually had a conversation with the lead investigator on this, that just because it's in the blood does not have anything to do with what's actually happening inside the eye necessarily. So that's going to be the key. That's going to be the variable that we need to understand more, is what is happening at the level of the cells inside the eye and why are they being regulated differently.
Absolutely. So right now, so Gloria is asking, and a lot of people are asking, just basically on balance right now, do you recommend for or against vitamin D supplements for people with both dry or wet AMD, or is it still just unknown?
So the short answer is it's unknown. We don't know if so let me take a step back. Vitamin D supplementation has become quite controversial in all the areas of medicine lately because people are doing large-based studies on how much vitamin D we need to take for it to be beneficial. There are the classic vitamin D deficiencies, which are in young kids with rickets, kids that never were exposed to sunlight. Of course, you supplement the vitamin D because it's deficient. So if you're vitamin D deficient, do you need supplementation? For sure. Am I saying that everyone with macular degeneration should get tested for vitamin D? Well, no, because that study that I just quoted showed there were no differences in the blood. The question is going to be, if we take supplements, do they actually get to the eye at the level that they're needed? Or is there a different version of supplementation that we're going to need to get it into the eye? And that's what we're trying to jump into. So I would be guessing if I were to tell you to take vitamin D supplements for macular degeneration. That I can't answer right now.
And Karen's asking too, like, are there any side effects of taking vitamin D? And if so, what they would be?
Right, so there are reports of vitamin D toxicity because of the way that how it affects calcium. And so there are people that will take, 8,000, 10,000, 50,000 units of vitamin D, far in excess than what's required. And there are case reports of this of having a number of effects on different areas of our body. For the most part, people that take supplementation within the 800 to 2 to 3,000 range, it's been reported to be quite safe and has no effect. I think it's once you start to go above 4,000 is when people start to say, well, maybe. And then there's the caveat of that assumes everything else is working. The way vitamin D is processed involves the liver and kidney. So if there's concurrent liver or kidney disease, this may affect the whole balance. And supplementing at much lower levels may not necessarily be as safe.
So definitely have to look at the holistic picture,
yeah.
Talk to your doctor before you start any supplementation. So you mentioned calcium. So Heather has a comment here about calcium. So she said recently she was told that high levels of calcium might harm the eye in terms of AMD, and that preparations without calcium, I'm assuming she means vitamin preparations without calcium, are preferable for a small group of patients. Do you have any comments on that?
So I think they're referring to, what was the, I remember actually writing this in a grant recently that there might be some side effects with certain calcium supplements, but I think when they looked at a larger trial, there was no effect in calcium supplementation. So if you're, the one thing we always tell people is that if you can get your calcium supplementation from your diet, there's no need for calcium supplementation. So what does that mean? Well, it's just essentially finding out what are calcium-rich foods. Broccolis, I believe, are one of the ones that are richest in calcium, and having a cup of this or scattered throughout your week would probably give you a sufficient amount of calcium. Supplementing beyond that may not be very useful.
So then again, another vitamin that we often hear about is vitamin K. So Deborah was wondering, she says, also research has shown that vitamin K is needed for proper or best absorption of vitamin D. Are you looking at all at vitamin K in the eye as well?
So vitamin K is they call it the vitamin that's most important in clotting, and something that a lot of people will know because babies used to get this as they were being born to prevent certain bad bleeding conditions. I'm not looking at vitamin K, and there are a lot of cofactors, the way that vitamins work, that they don't necessarily work in isolation. There needs to be a number of things for them to actually have effect. So, but no, I'm not looking at vitamin K.
Okay, let's see here. Sean has a question. Being fat-soluble vitamins, so vitamin A, D, E, and K, should we take these supplements with fatty food for better absorption?
So the ADEC or ADEK has to do with where they like to kind of sit and where they stay inside the body. I think for a person that's eating a healthy diet, you'll have no issues with absorption for these sorts of fat soluble vitamins. The question gets down to, when you are taking them, vitamin supplementation, like I said, is a very controversial field in terms of, how much do you take, when do you take it, should you be taking them with meals, and the jury is still out. When we talk about vitamin D supplementation in the eye, or what I'm hoping to do with respect to macular degeneration in vitamin D, I suspect that we're going to get down to a molecule that may be as a result of vitamin D that's going to be the one that we need to go after, because vitamin D in itself has just too many forms and too many formulations, and it gets quite convoluted. So I wouldn't say that you need to take it with a fatty meal for you to get adequate absorption. If you're eating a normal balanced diet, you'll likely get the absorption of your vitamins. The question is, are they useful beyond a healthy diet? That's unknown.
So Lori Mensch said here in the Q&A, she says, I have a sun lamp for SAD, and lately I've seen an increase in floaters. Could this be related?
Oh, is that seasonal affective disorder, SAD? Okay.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is floaters, unrelated to macular degeneration for the most part, unless you get a really bad bleed in the eye. But essentially, we all have a gel in the back of our eye called the vitreous. That jelly changes its composition and shape as we get older, to the point where it starts to move and shift, and it leaves little bits of itself in clumps, which create little shadows. And as a result of that, we start to see floaters. So is it possible that the sun lamp is emphasizing the shadowing effect such that you're seeing floaters? A lot of the time when we see people in our clinics, they'll say, oh, I've looked up into the sun and I notice my floaters, but then I don't notice them in a normal lighting area. That is classically what you see with the normal floaters. But floaters can also be bleeding, and that can be related to retinal detachment. So if you're seeing a sudden burst of new floaters that are staying there, someone saying, oh, I see dozens or hundreds of new floaters and they're not going away, and I'm getting these flashing lights, that is not related to your sun lamp, and that would require a dilated eye exam to make sure you're not having a retinal issue. So I think the sun lamp may be emphasizing what's just a normal aging feature, but anytime you have a new floaters, this should be investigated.
Absolutely. So Mira asks, we talk about vitamin D, but she says, are there vitamin D eye drops that can be used, or is it just a oral supplement?
There are no vitamin D eye drops, and currently what people are looking at is, if you look at the tears in people with just normal young adults, and you look at the tears in our eye normally, there actually is a fair amount of vitamin D in there. And in fact, it's probably higher than what we see in the blood. So does this speak to what our cornea at the front of our eye needs? And there's a lot of exciting research coming out with respect to vitamin D, the cornea, dry eye disease. But similar to the blood, the outside of the eye may not necessarily mean the inside of the eye. And based on the formulation of vitamin D, just putting a drop of it in may not necessarily get in. But excellent question. And yes, something that I've been very curious about and wondered, if this works, what are we doing? How are we going to get it in? What is it going to look like? So there's a number of questions around that for sure.
Okay, great. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So let me just see here. So Nancy, she's mentioning Lucentis and Eylea. So we talked a little bit about, especially for wet AMD, there are injections that people can get. And she's asking sort of, how do Lucentis and Eylea compare, in your opinion?
So those are two, second, third generation anti-VEGF treatments for wet macular degeneration and as well neovascular diseases of the eye, including diabetes. And in terms of their comparisons in trials, they have always come out to be about the same, but there is early evidence suggesting that potentially Eylea would last longer, such that the injection frequency could be stretched longer. And this has to do with the way that Eylea is formed over Lucentis. Now, that hasn't actually come out in clinical trials as being different. What we know is that they are the same in terms of their efficacy and in terms of preventing that neovascularization from coming back. Now, there are now 4th and 5th generation anti-VEGFs that are currently in the 3rd phase of clinical trials that are showing potentially, now the next generation after Eylea, potentially showing that maybe we can inject and wait 3 months. There's also scientific studies looking at, can we do an eye drop variant of this to prevent the injection? So there's a lot of, I think the way macular degeneration is going to be treated in the next 5 years will be very different than what we're doing today. Just because there's so many different agents that are available to us, and there are a number that are coming out out of the marketplace. So it'll be interesting to see.
Absolutely. So I think just maybe 1 or 2 more. So Ivy says, have anti-inflammatory, I'm assuming drugs been tried for AMD?
Very particular ones, things of the complement pathway. Complement is one of the arms of the immune system that's involved in helping us fight off infections. And the theory is that there's abnormal complement activation that's turned on. Again, why does it get turned on in people with AMD? Is there some sort of trigger that happens? This brings me into another area of research that I'm interested in that has to do with microbes around the eye and how they affect AMD, but we're not going to get into that today. But essentially, they haven't shown to be, the pre-clinical trial basic science studies showed to be very big, showed some really interesting effects, but we haven't seen that turn out in the clinical trials. Now, I wonder if that has to do with, we're looking at a particular end stage of macular degeneration. So the question is, if you think about the initiation of inflammation, you have to block it at the beginning. That's when it's starting. You can't say, once it's in, everything has been destroyed, oh, let's block the inflammatory pathway. I don't think you're going to be very effective. But that's the hard part with some of these drugs, is that they're very potent, and you're not going to give them to someone that's not showing any clinical disease. If they have good vision, yes, we know they're progressing. We're not going to treat. We're just going to watch because you have excellent vision. And we know right now that once you become a wet macular degeneration, we have a very good, effective, safe drug, anti-VEGF, that works. So it's very hard to disrupt that pathway right now when you have very good ways of monitoring AMD. Where I think the new line of research is going to be is, how do you prevent AMD from being turned on and progressing in that dry pathway? And that's where I want to see this vitamin D and these other molecules in the eye that I'm studying start to play a role. And that's where I'm hoping we go.
Wonderful. So last question here is from Christina, and Christina's asking, how can we help you get further funding and support for your research?
That's a good question. The hard part with funding vision science is that we make up a very small area of medicine, but the impact to people is probably one of the biggest. If you look at polls of people in medicine that are afflicted with various conditions, what would they rather have affected? I'll tell you, vision is never the one that people pick. They'd rather have anything else happen to them rather than their vision becoming affected. So therefore, how do we get more vision research happening? We need our governments to fund vision science research. We need people like myself to have protected space, protected areas, such that we can explore these questions and still have the funding to continue working. But funding basic science research currently is not at the highest point it's been at, and that reflects government budgets. So where I see things turning in the next little while, and which I don't think we do a very good job of this, is just going to our communities, going to businesses, going to private public partnerships. We need to look for alternatives to getting research funded. And it's not going to always be like the traditional ways that we thought of 50 years ago. That worked well when populations were much smaller, where we could actually do it. We're dealing with a very different beast today. So we need to be creative in our solutions, and we can't just say, oh, well, you know, what do we do next? The problem is that you get people like me starting our careers and we start to recruit more people. If there's no funding, things fizzle out and die. And therefore, people aren't going to spend forever trying to force their research through. It just becomes, you just can't get it done. Research, unfortunately, is very expensive. I'm learning that in the first few years that it's very difficult to fund research. It's expensive. And so what do we do? How do you convince people to spend the money on basic science research when we can say, well, why don't we just spend our money in just treating people with what we have? Well, we know what that means. It means that just we're keep pushing things for treating at the very end. It takes a very concerted effort to get people to reshift their focus in preventative medicine or preventing things from starting. And science has just an important role there as well. It's just hard to catch on. So that's, the short and long of it is I think we just need to be creative with how we get people to get involved. And is it going to our governments? Is it, holding seminars? Is it holding funding events for research programs? I thought about that. I thought of, what if I were to hold an event and start talking about funding research? It'd be very atypical, right? Like it's not the very traditional way, but what else do we have? If you're applying for grants and you're not getting the funding, what else are you going to do? Just close up shop? Like, I think we just need to be creative. Sorry, I said that a lot, but
absolutely. And in a very real way, this year is exciting for us at Fighting Blindness Canada. We're hosting 3 separate grant competitions this year.
Great.
So definitely spreading the word about that. And there are lots of ways that our supporters can get involved there as well. Larissa, did you have anything you wanted to say there?
I just wanted to sort of thank Dr. Rouleau for giving such a great example, or explanation of why funding research is so important. I thought you did a really great job. Even so, you should hold an event because I think people would come. But it really is about investing in the early research so that we can get new treatments, but also, like you're saying, so we can prevent diseases as well. So it's not just about treatments at the end; those are really important, but also understanding why diseases happen and how can we slow them down.
Right.
So
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need more foundations like yours. Like I said, it's just very difficult when there's so many other conditions that affect so many more people. It becomes a game of numbers. But if we recalibrate people's thinkings in terms of, greatest effect on life, I think you can ask anybody that's listening to this that's been affected by macular degeneration, that's actually taken away their vision, that they would do whatever they had to get that vision back. That's the thing with vision. You don't think it's going to affect you until it does. And once it does, you would do anything to get that back. And so how do you convince people to give you money if their vision's normal, right? So if you're lobbying people, how do you convince them to say, this is important? They'll say, well, you can't really appreciate vision loss, right? You can't say, well, in 10 years, I'm going to have this condition and it's going to affect the way I function on a daily basis. So that's where I think the difficulty in vision research is that you can only lobby the right people that have been affected by it. Everyone else doesn't really get it. They're like, well, I get heart disease, I get lung disease, but vision loss, no, I see fine, right? So that's the hard part in this, is that we need to go to the right people to kind of promote this concept and helping them understand why this is critical.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rouleau.
My pleasure.
It's really interesting, all about the research. And again, this is a great discussion about how we can advocate for getting more research like yours funded as well.
Right.
Before we close out today, I do want to actually ask my colleague Josie, if you're there, Josie, you can unmute, just to say a few words, again, in a real way of how you can get involved in helping us fund the exciting research that Fighting Blindness Canada is involved in.
That's wonderful. Thank you so very much, Morgan. My name is Josie, and I'm the Donor Relations Officer at Fighting Blindness Canada. I'd like to just take a moment of your time today to talk to you about our monthly giving program. Before I begin, I would like to thank our core supporters who are current monthly donors to Fighting Blindness Canada. Every day you are making a difference by funding the very best vision research. Thank you so very much. Monthly donors are such an important part of our Fighting Blindness community. Their donations provide reliable and ongoing funding so that future projects and long-term investments in vision research are possible. You can make a difference, a tremendous impact by joining our monthly giving program today. For as little as $1 a day or even $10 per month, every monthly gift is meaningful and makes a difference. Please consider joining our community of core supporters today. You can help create a brighter future for people living with vision loss and their families. To join, please visit our website at fightingblindness.ca or contact me at 1-800-461-3331, extension 262. I'd love to speak with you. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Josie.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to Dr. Rulo, Dr. Moniz, and of course, Steve Ricci and CNIB Smart Life for joining us today. If you enjoyed this webinar, please do visit our Viewpoint page. We've got a few more webinars already scheduled. Our next webinar is going to be on March 10th, and it's going to be all about glaucoma. We also have sessions scheduled in the coming months on gene therapy and caregiving. It's going to be a really exciting spring for us, so I hope you'll join us. And of course, if you've been to these webinars before, you know I always ask you to fill out that short survey afterwards just to let us know how we did today. I thank you again for joining us. Please stay safe and healthy, and I look forward to connecting with you all again soon. Take care.
Thanks again.